In the cities where winter came early and lingered late, where snow settled upon rooftops in October and refused to leave until May, there existed a small rectangle of paper that held more power than any sword, any decree, any manifesto written in bold letters. It was a card, nothing more, thin as a whisper, fragile as hope, yet upon its surface stamped with numbered squares, marked with dates and categories, and the bureaucratic language of survival rested the mathematics of tomorrow. Whether you would wake, whether your children would wake, whether the morning would bring another day or only silence. It is said that in those years when the world was at war and the Eastern Front consumed armies like a great dark mouth, the people learned a different kind of calculation, not the calculations of strategy or victory, not the grand mathematics of nations and borders, but the small, terrible arithmetic of grams, of ounces, of the difference between a worker's ration and a dependent's ration, measured in mouthfuls of bread that could sustain or fail to sustain. The cards were issued monthly, delivered through channels as precise as any military operation, categorized by contribution to the war effort, sorted by value assigned to human life. The laborer, the one who stood at the factory lathe shaping metal, whose hands bled and whose back bent under the weight of production quotas, this person received more. The clerk, who shuffled papers and recorded numbers, received less than the laborer but more than the child. And the babushka, the grandmother too old to work, whose hands had once been strong but were now gnarled like winter branches, she received least of all. The system was precise. It had to be. Precision was survival. Precision was the difference between order and chaos, between a nation that endured and a nation that collapsed under the weight of its own hunger. We descend now into the morning bread lines, into the hours before dawn when darkness still held the city in its cold embrace. The queues formed in shadow silent processions of bundled figures clutching their ration cards like sacred texts, like prayers written on paper that might or might not be answered. They waited. They had always waited, but this waiting was different. This was not the waiting of patience, but the waiting of desperation, carefully controlled, channeled into orderly lines that stretched around corners, down streets, into distances where the end could not be seen. And there, drifting through the frozen air, came a smell, the smell of baking bread. It reached those waiting like a physical thing, like hands that touched the body and stirred hunger so profound it became pain. Backs bent forward, bodies swayed. Some closed their eyes as if the smell alone could nourish. The bakeries operated around the clock, their ovens never cooling, their windows fogged with steam that seemed to mock those standing in the cold outside. The bakers worked shifts that blurred into continuous labor, shaping dough into loaves that would be divided with mathematical precision, weighed to the gram, distributed according to the stamps on the cards. In those lines, whispers circulated like currency. Which bakery still had flour? Which queue was moving faster? Had there been another cut to the rations? The rumors spread through the darkness, passed from bundled figure to bundled figure. Information traded with the urgency of survival, because knowing mattered. Knowing which line to join, which bakery to trust, which hours to arrive, these small pieces of knowledge could mean the difference between receiving your portion or standing in line for hours only to be turned away when supplies ran out. And in the homes, in the communal apartments where families crowded into single rooms, mothers made calculations that should never be required of any human being. How much to save for the children? How much must she eat herself to maintain the strength needed for the factory shift? If she collapsed from weakness, the family would lose not just her labor, but her ration category. A worker's card was worth more than a dependent's card. But if she ate what she needed to remain strong, would there be enough for the little ones whose bodies were growing, who needed nourishment that could not be provided? Some mothers ate less than they required, saving portions for their children, watching their own bodies weaken and thin, until climbing the stairs to the apartment became an exhausting journey. Some made the opposite choice, ate what they needed to work, watched their children's cheeks hollow, told themselves that survival meant the whole family surviving, not just the young. There was no right answer. There was only choice made in darkness, in fear, in love that had to calculate coldly or risk losing everything. The system worked because it was comprehensive. The cards were not just about bread, they represented access to all food, to sugar and flour and the occasional piece of meat, to tea and to the ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. Every item had its price in stamps. Every stamp represented value calculated by distant bureaucrats who determined how much life each category of person deserved. The cards were checked, stamped, recorded. The system knew who ate and who did not, who lived and who slowly faded. And there was something else. The cards represented a kind of terrible honesty. The state could not feed everyone equally. Resources were scarce. Choices had to be made. In other times, in other places, such scarcity might have led to chaos, to violence, to the breakdown of social order. But here the cards imposed structure. They organized scarcity. They made hunger orderly. They turned survival into bureaucracy, which meant survival could be administered, controlled, predicted. But the cards also revealed the ideology beneath the bureaucracy. Because the categories were not neutral, they reflected values, judgments about whose life mattered more. The worker mattered more than the child, not because children were not valued, but because workers produced weapons, produced steel, produced the machinery of war that might determine whether the nation survived. The elderly mattered least, not because they were unloved, but because they could not contribute, and contribution was the measure by which life was portioned. This was the mathematics of survival in a nation at total war. It was mercy because it meant millions were fed who might otherwise have starved. It was cruelty because it meant some were condemned to slow hunger while others received enough. It was efficiency that saved a nation. It was ideology that determined which lives would be saved. The cards exist still, preserved now in archives, handled carefully by researchers who study them like ancient texts. They are fragile paper yellowed by decades, stamps faded until barely visible, the ink of names and dates blurred. But they speak still. They testify to the impossible choices made in those years. They bear witness to the mathematics of hunger, to survival measured in grams, to the bureaucratic organization of life and death. Some cards show all their stamps used evidence of a person who survived month by month through the war years, who received their portions, who endured. Other cards show stamps unused, terminated mid-month, the date of death recorded in neat handwriting, life calculated to the day. And perhaps most haunting are the cards for children, for small bodies whose rations were smallest, whose stamps sometimes mark only a few months before stopping, testimony to the youngest victims of a mathematics that could not account for the particular vulnerability of the very young. The system organized survival. The cards made hunger countable, made it something that could be managed and recorded. But they could not make it just, could not make it fair, could not resolve the fundamental truth that in those years, in those cities where winter came early, some lived and some died, and the difference was measured in the stamps on a small rectangle of paper that held more power than any throne, any weapon, any dream of victory. The cards remain, speaking their quiet mathematics, bearing witness to what was endured, to the morning bread lines, to the mother's impossible choices, to the bureaucracy that fed millions and condemned millions, to survival organized by the state and measured in grams, to the years when life itself could be portioned, stamped, calculated, controlled. The cards remain, and in their silence they remember everything. in the halls where machines never stopped, where the sound of metal shaping metal became a kind of endless prayer. Women stood at stations that had belonged to men. We begin with the sound, the hammer and press, the screaming of lathes, the rhythmic pounding that erased the boundary between day and night, between one shift and the next, until time itself became only the continuous motion of production. When the men marched westward to meet the invader, when armies formed from fathers and sons and brothers, the factories could not stop, could not pause, could not allow production to slow even for a moment. The motherland demanded tanks, demanded shells, demanded the machinery of war shaped by whatever hands remained. It is said that in the summer of 1941, when the invasion came and the world seemed to tilt toward darkness, there was a moment when the question hung in the air: could production continue without the workers who had always run the machines? The answer came not from planning but from necessity. The women went to the factories. Farm women who had known only the earth and the harvest, grandmothers who had thought their working days were behind them, girls barely old enough to be called women, mothers who left children in whatever care could be found. They came to the factory floors and learned the language of metallurgy. The transformation was swift because it had to be. There was no time for lengthy training, no luxury of gradual adjustment. The machines were waiting. The production quotas had not changed. The front needed weapons, and the front did not care whether the hands that shaped them were calloused from plowing fields or soft from domestic work. The women learned the precise temperatures that made steel strong enough to stop a bullet, weak enough to be shaped. They learned the timing that determined whether a shell casing would hold its charge or rupture in the barrel, killing the soldier who fired it. They learned to read the glow of molten metal like reading the sky before harvest, learned to judge by color and shimmer when the moment for shaping had arrived. Whispers tell us that the first weeks were chaos, burns, and injuries, mistakes that cost production, the terrible learning curve of working with machines designed for bodies stronger and larger than most women possessed. But necessity is a powerful teacher, and desperation makes quick students. The women adapted. They built platforms to reach controls set too high. They worked in teams to lift what one person could not lift alone. They developed techniques that used leverage instead of strength, precision instead of force. They became, in ways the planners had not anticipated, sometimes more efficient than the men they replaced because they had to think differently, had to solve problems that brute strength could not solve. The shifts were brutal. 12 hours became the minimum. 16 was common. Some women simply slept beneath their machines for a few hours before the next shift began, rather than waste time traveling home and back. The factories were freezing in winter. Fuel was saved for the production process, not for heating the vast halls where women worked in gloves with fingers cut away so they could maintain dexterity. In summer, the heat from furnaces and forges made the air shimmer, made breathing difficult, turned the factory floors into infernos where women worked until they collapsed, were revived, and returned to their stations. We sit now in one of these factories, in the memory of what was. Imagine the scene: hundreds of women at lathes and presses, the air thick with metal dust and the smoke of welding, the noise so constant that communication happened through gestures, through the shared understanding that develops among those who labor side by side in extremity. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of music in the industrial cacophony. The women sang sometimes, when the machines allowed it, songs that helped maintain pace, that made the hours pass, that connected them to something beyond the immediate task of shaping metal for killing. Some of these women had lost sons already. Some had husbands at the front whose fate was unknown. Some were working to create the very shells that might be fired by their own family members, the tanks that might carry their loved ones into battle. The contradiction was unbearable when examined too closely, so mostly they did not examine it. They worked. They met the quotas. They took pride in the quality of their production because quality meant the weapon would work, would protect, would perhaps bring someone home alive. The factories became communities unto themselves. Friendships were forged in shared exhaustion, in the mutual understanding of those who endure the same hardships. Women who had never met before the war became sisters in labor, sharing food when they had it, covering for each other when illness or injury made work impossible, mourning together when the dreaded telegrams came announcing that someone's son or husband would not return. There was love in these factory halls, the kind of love that emerges when people depend absolutely on one another, when survival is collective rather than individual. But there was also loss that could not be measured. Loss of health, bodies broken by labor too hard, by lifting too much, by exposure to chemicals and metals and conditions that ravaged lungs and skin. Loss of children who grew up without mothers present, raised by grandmothers or neighbors, or in the care of overcrowded orphanages. Loss of years that could not be reclaimed, of youth spent in factory halls instead of in sunlight, of possibilities that war erased. The propaganda posters showed these women as heroic figures, strong and smiling, holding aloft the weapons they had made with pride gleaming in their eyes. And there was truth in this. They were heroic. They did take pride. They understood their work mattered in ways that transcended their individual lives. But the posters did not show the exhaustion that ran so deep it became a permanent condition, did not show the hands scarred by burns and cuts, did not show the women who worked through pregnancy because stopping meant losing the worker's ration card, did not show the coughing that came from breathing metal dust for years, did not show the grief that had nowhere to go, that had to be swallowed so production could continue. By the war's end, women had produced millions of shells, hundreds of thousands of tanks and aircraft, the vast machinery that made victory possible. The Soviet Union's survival depended on many factors, but among the most crucial was this transformation, the conversion of women into industrial workers on a scale never before attempted, the mobilization of an entire gender into production roles that had seemed impossible before necessity demanded them. After the war, some women returned to traditional roles, grateful to leave the factories behind. Others remained, having discovered capabilities they had not known they possessed, having learned trades that provided independence and income. The factories had transformed them, and some of that transformation could not be undone even when peace returned. They had become steel, in a sense more profound than metaphor, had learned hardness and strength, had discovered what they could endure, had proven to themselves and to history that the categories that had defined possibility before the war were not fixed but were permeable, could be rewritten by necessity. We close now in the silence of the factory floors, the machines long stilled, the furnaces cold, the vast halls empty except for memory. But if we listen carefully in the space between sleep and waking, we can almost hear it still, the rhythm of production, the sound of women shaping steel, the songs that maintained pace, the continuous motion that defined those years. The women who became steel, the hands that shaped weapons, the transformation that survival demanded, the factory floors where a generation learned that what seemed impossible was only impossible until it had to be done. They worked, they endured, they survived. And the steel they shaped was not just metal but was themselves, forged in the fires of necessity into something harder, stronger, capable of bearing what should not have been bearable. The women who became steel, forever working, forever shaping, forever testifying to what was demanded and what was given, the factory floors, the machines, the hands, the steel, all of it remembered, all of it testimony. all of it speaking still in the silence of history, about what was endured when the world was at war, and survival required transformation too profound for words to fully capture. In the city built on water and ambition, in the place where Peter the Great had forced a capital from swamp and determination, 900 days would pass that felt like a single, endless night. We begin in September 1941, when the circle closed around Leningrad, when German and Finnish forces surrounded the city on all sides, when supply lines were severed with a precision that revealed the intent not to capture quickly, but to starve slowly, to let winter and hunger do what armies alone might not accomplish. The siege was not battle in the traditional sense, was not the clash of armies, not the taking and retaking of territory. The siege was subtraction, the gradual removal of everything that sustained life. First went the railway connections, then the roads. Finally, even the thin lifeline across Lake Ladoga became treacherous as German artillery found its range. The city that had housed nearly 3 million souls became an island surrounded not by water but by winter, by armies, by the slow certainty of starvation. It is said that in the first months there was still hope. Surely the siege would be broken. Surely relief would come. Surely the Red Army would push through and reopen the supply lines. But autumn became winter, and winter in Leningrad is not a season but a siege of its own, temperatures dropping to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. Cold so profound it stopped time, froze breath, turned the city into a landscape of ice and darkness. We descend now into that first winter, into November and December 1941, when the rations were cut and cut again, until workers received 250 grams of bread daily, less than half a pound, and children received 125 grams, less than a quarter pound. The bread itself was barely bread sawdust mixed with whatever could be ground into flour, wallpaper paste, cottonseed cake intended for livestock. It was brown and dense and tasted of desperation, but it was what existed, and existence depended on it. Fuel disappeared. The electricity failed. Water froze in pipes and stayed frozen. People burned furniture to create moments of warmth that could not touch the cold settling in bones, in walls, in the very air. They burned books, precious volumes from personal libraries, consumed page by page for a few minutes of heat. They burned whatever would burn, and when there was nothing left to burn, they wore every piece of clothing they owned and huddled in corners of rooms in the spaces where cold was fractionally less intense. The city became a landscape of snow and silence. The trams stopped running. The streetlights went dark. The only sounds were the occasional bomb falling, the distant thunder of artillery, and a new sound, the sound of wooden sleds being pulled through streets. The sleds carried bodies. At first, families tried to bury their dead with dignity, with ritual. But as winter deepened and starvation spread, the protocols of mourning collapsed. Bodies were wrapped in sheets if sheets could be spared, placed on sleds, pulled to collection points where they would eventually be transported to mass graves. Or sometimes the bodies simply lay where they fell, covered by snow, waiting for spring. Whispers tell us that the most terrible thing was not the dying itself, but the speed with which it became ordinary. The mind adapts to protect itself, and so death in the streets became part of the landscape, became background rather than tragedy, became too common to fully register each individual loss. People stepped over bodies, walked past them. The capacity for horror exhausts itself, and what remains is a kind of numb acceptance, a psychological shrinking that allowed survival by not feeling too much. Yet within this horror something else existed simultaneously: the symphony. In August 1942, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, was performed in the city's Philharmonic Hall. The musicians were emaciated, barely strong enough to hold their instruments. Some had died during rehearsals and been replaced. The audience sat in the unheated hall wearing everything they owned, breath visible in the cold air. But they came. They listened. And in that listening was defiance more powerful than any weapon, the assertion that culture, that beauty, that humanity itself would persist even in winter's grave. The factories continued operating. Somehow, impossibly, production continued. Workers too weak to stand propped themselves against machines. They fulfilled quotas even as they died doing so. The logic was beyond logic. If production stopped, the defense stopped, and if the defense stopped, the city would fall. So production continued because it had to, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender was unthinkable even when survival itself seemed impossible. The radio broadcasts continued. Radio Leningrad transmitted throughout the siege, and when there was nothing to broadcast, they transmitted the sound of a metronome tick, 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 the rhythm proving the city still lived, still measured time, still existed even in the depths of winter and starvation. The metronome became a heartbeat, a pulse that told those listening that Leningrad endured. We sit now with the mathematics of death. The exact number is debated still. Estimates range from 600,000 to over 1 million dead during the siege. The uncertainty exists because death by starvation leaves no clear mark, because bodies in mass graves are difficult to count, because records were incomplete when survival took precedence over documentation. But the scale is undeniable. A city that had housed 3 million saw perhaps a third perish during those 900 days. Winter's harvest was measured in hundreds of thousands of frozen, starved bodies. Spring brought no relief, only revelation. The snow melted to expose what winter had hidden: bodies everywhere. The dead who had lain beneath the snow, now visible in horrible abundance. The city organized cleaning brigades to collect the bodies, to restore some semblance of order to streets that had become open graveyards. The smell, the sight, the sheer number of dead, it was trauma layered upon trauma, horror following horror. The siege was finally broken in January 1944, but breaking the siege did not heal what it had inflicted. Those who survived carried memories that could not be processed, could not be integrated into normal psychology. How do you forget seeing your mother die of starvation? How do you forget eating things that were not food? How do you forget the cold, the darkness, the knowledge that death was approaching, and there was nothing that could stop it except the random chance of surviving one more day? The siege of Leningrad became symbol and reality, both symbol of Soviet endurance, of the determination to resist to the last, of the suffering willingly endured for the motherland. But it was also reality of policy decisions, of strategic calculations that determined some cities would be defended no matter the cost to civilians. The civilian population could have been evacuated earlier. Supply lines could have been prioritized differently. But military logic prevailed, and military logic accepted civilian casualties as part of the calculus of defense. We close now in silence in the memorial that exists now where the siege happened. The graves, the monuments, the eternal flame, the names carved in stone. But no monument can fully capture what those 900 days meant, what it was to live to survive winter's siege. No words are adequate, no tribute sufficient. What remains is simply the fact of endurance, the evidence that somehow, impossibly, hundreds of thousands lived through what should have killed everyone, that the city survived, that the siege eventually ended even though ending felt impossible during its depths. The siege that turned a city into winter's grave. The 900 days, the starvation, the cold, the death that became ordinary, the culture that persisted in defiance, the production that continued, the radio that broadcast, the survivors who carried memories too heavy to bear yet bore them anyway. All of it now history, preserved in archives and memorials and the stories told by descendants. But once it was present tense. Once it was today, and tomorrow, and the day after, stretching into an infinity of cold and hunger and death. Once it was life lived at the edge of extinction, endured because there was no alternative, survived through will and chance and the random luck of who received slightly more food, who stayed slightly warmer, who lived through winter when so many did not. The city built on water became the city buried in snow, became winter's grave, became testimony to what humans can endure when endurance is all that remains. The siege, the winter, the 900 days, forever remembered, forever impossible to fully comprehend, forever standing as evidence of suffering that defies adequate description, of survival that seems miraculous, of a city that died and did not die, that became grave and remained life, that endured what should not have been endurable. The silence holds it still. The winter, the city, the siege, forever. In the spaces between danger, in the moments when the air raid sirens stopped their wailing, and the sky released its temporary reprieve, children created worlds from ruins. We begin with the simple truth that even in war, even in occupation and siege and the daily proximity of death, childhood finds expression changed, damaged, but persistent in its need to play, to imagine, to transform horror into something that might be controlled through games. It is said that in the cities struck by bombs, in the neighborhoods where buildings collapsed into rubble, the children would emerge from shelters and immediately begin their games. Hide and seek played in collapsed apartments, the destroyed rooms providing hiding places that would have delighted in peacetime, but now carried the weight of real concealment, real danger still lurking in unstable structures. Mock battles using sticks as rifles, bottle caps as grenades, debris as the machinery of war that dominated the adult world. They played at being soldiers because soldiers were what they saw, what filled their days, what defined their reality. The children of wartime Soviet Union knew truths that should never touch youth. They understood evacuation, the hurried packing, the train stations crowded with families being sent eastward away from the advancing armies, the separation from parents who stayed behind to work in factories or fight on fronts. They knew the sound of bombs, knew the difference between distant explosions and close ones, learned to judge by sound alone how much danger existed, developed instincts for survival that children should never need to develop. We descend now into the evacuations, the trains packed beyond capacity, children crowded into compartments and corridors, traveling for days toward destinations in the Urals or Siberia or Central Asia. Some traveled with their mothers. Some traveled in groups organized by schools or orphanages. Hundreds of children supervised by a handful of adults, moving through a landscape at war. The journeys were chaotic, uncertain schedules, stops at stations where water and food were scarce, arrivals in cities and towns unprepared for the influx, the overwhelming logistics of finding shelter and food for evacuees. The orphanages swelled. Estimates suggest millions of children lost one or both parents during the war, to death on the front, to siege conditions, to displacement that scattered families, to the thousand ways war tears families apart. The orphanages did what they could with resources that were never adequate. Children slept in shifts when beds were insufficient. Food was rationed even more strictly than for the general population. Caregivers struggled to provide not just material needs, but the emotional care that children required, though the ratio of children to adults made individual attention nearly impossible. Whispers tell us of the children who lived on the streets, the besprizorniki who fled orphanages or never reached them, who survived through theft and mutual protection, who formed gangs in railway stations and ruins, who learned skills of survival that were too adult, too harsh. They stole food from markets and cargo trains. They traded in whatever could be traded. They protected each other with a fierce loyalty born of shared abandonment. Some were eventually collected by authorities and returned to institutions. Others remained in the shadows throughout the war, a population of feral children that spoke to the breakdown of normal social structures, to the inability of the state to care for all its youngest citizens. But there were also children taken in by relatives or neighbors, absorbed into households already stretched beyond capacity, fed from portions that were already insufficient, loved despite being additional burdens in a time when burden was measured in survival. These children grew up understanding they were lucky, that others had not been taken in, that their presence was both welcomed and difficult. They learned to be quiet, to need less, to contribute however they could, even when they were too young to contribute much. The schools continued in many places, classes held in basements when above ground was too dangerous, lessons interrupted by air raids, education maintained as symbol of normalcy even when nothing else was normal. Teachers taught from memory when textbooks were unavailable, used scraps of paper for assignments when proper materials could not be found, maintained discipline and routine, because routine was psychological anchor when everything else was chaos. The children studied mathematics and literature and history, even while history was being made in violence all around them. We sit now with the children who worked in factories when labor shortages were desperate, at tasks too dangerous for children, but necessity overrode protection. Children of 12 or 13 operating machinery, working shifts nearly as long as adults, contributing to production quotas because every hand was needed. In fields, harvesting crops while adults fought or worked in distant factories, children doing agricultural labor that kept the nation fed. The work was hard, the hours long, the conditions harsh. But it was also contribution, and contribution mattered, meant value, meant being part of survival rather than merely dependent. The trauma was pervasive though rarely acknowledged. The expectation was that children would be resilient, that youth meant ability to adapt, that the state's need for productivity and morale outweighed individual psychological wounds. There was no framework for child trauma counseling, no recognition that what children experienced would leave scars as deep as any physical wound. The children who saw parents killed, who endured siege conditions or occupation brutality, who were separated from families and never reunited, they carried these experiences forward with little support for processing them. The propaganda shaped young minds with stories of heroic youth, young partisans who fought behind enemy lines, children who reported spies and saboteurs, the cultivation of loyalty to state and Stalin as father figure more constant than actual fathers who were absent. The indoctrination was thorough, began early, used schools and youth organizations, and the pervasive messaging of posters and films. The war provided context that made such indoctrination more effective when the nation's survival was at stake. Loyalty was not abstract virtue but immediate necessity. Some children became informants, reporting on parents or neighbors, repeating overheard conversations to authorities. Whether from genuine belief in duty or from manipulation by adults, children became instruments of surveillance, their innocence weaponized. The consequences could be devastating, families destroyed by reports from their own children, the betrayal adding another layer of trauma to an already traumatic existence. We reflect now on what it meant to be young during those years. Childhood is supposed to be protected time, developmental period where play and growth happen in relative safety. But for millions of Soviet children during the war, childhood meant labor and loss, meant fear and hunger, meant growing up too fast because gradual maturation was luxury war did not permit. The children who survived carried forward into adult life the imprint of those years, the food insecurity that made them hoard, the hypervigilance developed from living with constant danger, the difficulty trusting when trust had been betrayed so often, the particular grief of losses that occurred when they were too young to fully process them. Yet there was also resilience that defies easy explanation. Human children have remarkable capacity to adapt, to find joy even in dire circumstances, to create play from nothing, to love and bond even when everything teaches them that love means loss. The children who played war in rubble streets were simultaneously damaged and surviving, traumatized and adapting, victims and agents of their own continuation. We close now in silence, imagining those children, the ones who became adults, who grew old, who carried wartime memories their entire lives. Some spoke of their experiences. Most did not, or spoke only in fragments, or told stories that emphasized heroism and endurance while leaving silences where the worst memories lived. The children of war became the elders who remembered, and now those elders are passing, and with them goes the lived memory, leaving only records and oral histories and photographs of young faces marked by experiences that childhood should never hold. The children who played war in rubble streets, the evacuations, the orphanages, the street children, the young workers, the trauma unacknowledged, the resilience unexplained. The childhood that was not childhood but was something else, survival, adaptation, the transformation forced by war on the youngest, the most vulnerable, those who had no choice but to endure because children cannot choose the world they are born into, can only live in it as it is, can only survive if survival is possible, can only carry forward what they experienced whether they wanted to carry it or not. The silence holds them. The memory preserves them. The history records them. Forever young in old photographs, forever marked by years that should have been safe but were warfare, were hunger, were loss. The children, forever playing in the rubble, forever creating worlds from ruins, forever testimony to what the young endured when the world was at war and childhood ended before it properly began. In the building with windowless rooms, in the offices where files accumulated like sediment of fear, the watchers maintained their vigilance even while armies fought at the gates. We begin with a contradiction that defined Soviet existence during the war years, while millions mobilized to defend the motherland against external invasion. Another machinery operated internally, suspecting, investigating, disappearing those deemed insufficiently loyal. The NKVD People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs was instrument of Stalin's will, guardian of ideological purity, enforcer of loyalty through terror. And the war did not pause its operations. If anything, the war provided new categories of suspicion, new reasons for disappearance, new justifications for vigilance that was already paranoid. It is said that even in the darkest months of 1941, when German armies pushed toward Moscow, when the capital prepared for siege or fall, the midnight arrests continued. The knock on the door in darkness, the black cars waiting, the sudden disappearance of neighbors or colleagues who were there one day and gone the next with no explanation provided. The machinery of internal terror operated parallel to the machinery of external defense, sometimes intersecting them in ways that defied rational military logic. We descend now into the mechanisms of suspicion. The NKVD maintained networks of informants, neighbors reporting on neighbors, colleagues reporting on colleagues, children reporting on parents. The system incentivized denunciation through fear and through reward, through the knowledge that failing to report could itself be evidence of disloyalty, through the perverse logic that assumed everyone had something to hide because, in a surveillance state, everyone eventually did something that could be interpreted as suspect. The denunciation letters accumulated in files, accusations written in hands that ranged from educated script to barely literate scrawl, motivations ranging from genuine belief in duty to personal vendettas dressed as patriotic concern. The arrests followed patterns that revealed the ideology of suspicion. Anyone who had lived under German occupation automatically became suspect. How had they survived? What compromises had they made? Had they collaborated? The assumption was guilt until proven otherwise, which was nearly impossible to prove. Prisoners of war who returned from German camps faced interrogation and often re-imprisonment. Stalin's infamous Order 270 had declared that surrender was treason, that death was preferable, that those who survived capture were either cowards or collaborators. So men who had endured the horror of German POW camps, who had survived when millions of other Soviet prisoners died, returned home to face another imprisonment, this time by their own government. Entire ethnic groups were deported during the war years on collective suspicion of potential collaboration. The Volga Germans, whose ancestors had been invited to Russia by Catherine the Great, were deported eastward in 1941 on suspicion of loyalty to Germany. The Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and others followed in subsequent years. Entire populations loaded onto trains, transported to Kazakhstan or Siberia or Central Asia, resettled in regions where survival was difficult, their traditional homelands repopulated by others. The deportations were carried out with brutal efficiency. Villages surrounded, populations given hours to pack, families separated, the elderly and sick often dying during transport, children lost in the chaos. Hundreds of thousands died from the deportations and their aftermath. We witness now the interrogations taking place in cells beneath the Lubyanka in Moscow, or in NKVD headquarters in every city, conducted by officials trained in techniques of psychological and physical coercion, designed to extract confessions regardless of guilt, operating on the principle that anyone arrested must be guilty of something, and if they were not guilty of what they were charged with, they could be made guilty through confession. The confessions were formulaic admission of counter-evolutionary activity, of espionage, of sabotage, of whatever crime the interrogator required for their report. The confessions were signed under duress, under torture, under threat to family, under the exhaustion of days without sleep, under the slow breaking of will that interrogation was designed to achieve. The gulags continued operating during the war, those vast labor camp systems stretching across Soviet territory, containing millions of prisoners whose labor was exploited for resource extraction and construction projects. Some camps emptied during the war as prisoners were formed into punishment battalions, units sent to the most dangerous sectors of the front, given minimal equipment, used as expendable forces, a chance to redeem themselves through death in service of the motherland. But the camps also filled with new arrivals, those arrested under wartime provisions, those deemed suspect, those who ran afoul of the system in ways both real and imagined. Whispers tell us of a fear that pervaded daily life, even as people worked in factories and volunteered for civil defense and contributed to the war effort. The fear that any conversation might be reported, that any complaint about conditions might be interpreted as defeatism, that any criticism of leadership might mean arrest, that friendships were dangerous because friends could become evidence against you. The surveillance was both real and psychological. There were actual informants everywhere. But the uncertainty about who was informing created atmosphere where everyone became potential informant in the mind of the fearful. The NKVD also operated at the front, maintaining blocking detachments behind Soviet lines, with orders to shoot soldiers who retreated without authorization. The blocking detachments were meant to prevent panic and desertion, to enforce the order that retreat without orders was forbidden, to create a choice between facing enemy fire forward or certain execution from behind. The policy was brutal, treating Soviet soldiers as if they required terror to fight effectively, assuming that fear of their own side was necessary supplement to whatever motivation patriotism and defense of homeland provided. We sit now with the files, millions of pages of accusations, interrogations, confessions, sentences. The files were secret during Soviet period, accessible only to security services, containing information used to control and manipulate. After Soviet collapse, some files were opened, allowing researchers and descendants to learn what had happened to disappeared relatives, to read the accusations that had led to arrest, to see the confessions extracted under duress. But many files remain classified, and some were destroyed, creating gaps in the record that will never be filled, silences about who was arrested and why, names that will never be recovered from the bureaucracy of terror. The contradiction at the heart of wartime Soviet Union was this: a nation fighting for survival against invasion, simultaneously consuming itself through internal purges and deportations and imprisonments. A population mobilized in common cause against external enemy, while being treated as potential internal enemies, requiring constant surveillance. The resources devoted to NKVD operations, the personnel, the materials, the transportation for deportations were resources that could have been used for defense. The lives lost to gulags and executions and deportations were lives that could have contributed to the war effort. But Stalin's paranoia and the system of control he had created continued operating regardless of rational military calculation. We reflect on what this meant for survival. Surviving the war meant not only enduring military threat and material hardship, but also navigating the parallel threat of state terror. It meant being careful about what you said, where you said it, to whom. It meant understanding that the wrong words, the wrong associations, the wrong ethnic background could mean disappearance regardless of loyalty or contribution. It meant living with fear not just of bombs and invasion, but of midnight arrest, of accusation, of the apparatus designed to find enemies even where no enemies existed. The victory over Germany in 1945 did not end the NKVD's operations. If anything, The immediate post-war period saw renewed purges, returning prisoners of war interrogated. Those who had lived in occupied territories investigated. The populations of newly acquired territories in Eastern Europe subjected to Soviet security apparatus. The paranoia that had characterized Stalin's rule before the war returned with full force, supplemented now by Cold War tensions that provided new categories of suspected disloyalty. We close in the silence of archives, in the files that speak of lives interrupted, ended, disappeared. The NKVD building stands still in Moscow, the Lubyanka, which was prison and headquarters both, where interrogations happened, and where the bureaucracy of terror maintained its records. It stands as museum now, as memorial, as reminder of the system that operated alongside the war effort, that never slept while cities burned and armies fought, that maintained its vigilance and its cruelty regardless of external threat, that treated Soviet citizens as potential enemies requiring constant watching, constant suspecting, constant disappearing when suspicion crystallized into action. The secret police who never slept, the files that accumulated, the arrests that continued, the deportations, the interrogations, the fear that pervaded, the contradiction of fighting for survival while consuming yourself from within. All of it part of the war experience for millions of Soviet citizens. All of it shaping survival and defining what it meant to live through those years. All of it testimony to a state that demanded total loyalty while trusting no one, that mobilized its people for common defense while treating them as potential traitors, that saved itself from external destruction while inflicting internal destruction on its own population. The machinery never stopped. The watchers never rested. The files accumulated, and the fear was as constant as the war itself, lasting longer, extending beyond victory, defining life in ways that military conflict alone could not define. The silence holds it still. The archives preserve it. The memory carries it forward, forever watching, forever suspecting, forever the terror that coexisted with war, forever. In the countryside where fields had been worked for generations, where the seasons had marked time more reliably than any calendar, absence created a landscape transformed. We begin with the departure columns of men marching away from villages toward assembly points, toward the front, toward a future that most would not survive. The women and elderly and children stood watching, hands raised in farewell, hearts heavy with knowledge that many of those marching would never return. The villages that remained were populated by those left behind, the feminized and aged and young, communities suddenly missing their strongest, their men of working age, their fathers and sons and brothers. It is said that the collective farms, those enterprises of Soviet agricultural policy that had already disrupted traditional village life, now faced the impossible task of maintaining production without the labor force that had sustained them. The men who had driven tractors, who had managed livestock, who had provided the physical strength that farming required, they were gone, marching westward to become soldiers, or already dead in the early catastrophes of 1941. What remained were women who now had to plow and plant and harvest, elderly people whose bodies were no longer strong enough for the labor demanded, children pressed into agricultural work when they should have been in school. We descend into the daily reality of these villages. The horses that had pulled plows were requisitioned for military transport. The tractors, where villages had them, were converted for army use or simply stopped working when fuel and parts became unavailable. What remained was human strength alone, women harnessing themselves to plows in some places, pulling the equipment themselves because there was no other option. The labor was crushing. The hours were from before dawn until darkness. The production quotas did not decrease to account for diminished workforce. If anything, they increased as the state demanded every possible kilogram of grain to feed armies and cities. The requisitions took most of what was grown. State purchasing agents arrived after harvest and demanded quantities calculated in distant offices, quantities that left barely enough for survival in the villages that had grown the food. The villagers who protested were reminded that soldiers at the front needed food, that cities producing weapons needed food, that personal survival was secondary to collective need. The requisitions created hunger in the very places that grew food, a bitter irony that rural populations understood too well, watching grain they had cultivated loaded onto trains to be transported elsewhere, while their own children's stomachs stayed empty. Whispers tell us of villages displaced by war's geography, populations in the path of German advance ordered to evacuate, given hours or days to gather possessions, to drive livestock eastward, to abandon homes and land their families had worked for generations. Some evacuations were organized, with state transportation provided. Others were chaotic families fleeing on foot or in carts, trying to stay ahead of advancing armies, becoming part of massive refugee flows that clogged roads and overwhelmed eastern regions unprepared for the influx. Some villages were evacuated, and then the evacuation order was reversed. people returning to find homes destroyed or occupied, villages transformed by battle into ruins. In the occupied zones, those territories that fell under German control for months or years, the villages faced different horror. The occupation was brutal, treating Soviet villagers as subhuman, exploiting their labor, taking their food, burning villages suspected of aiding partisans. The partisan movements that formed in forests and swamps were often supplied and supported by villages, creating dangerous position for rural populations caught between occupation forces demanding compliance and partisans demanding support. The reprisals were savage villages burned for suspected partisan collaboration, populations executed, the collective punishment that made no distinction between active resistance and simple survival. We sit now with the women who held villages together in men's absence. They became everything: farmer and administrator and parent and caretaker of the elderly, managing households and managing fields, making decisions about planting and harvest and survival that had traditionally been men's domain. They bore children whose fathers they might never see again, raised those children in circumstances of extreme hardship, maintained the family and the farm and the village structure through will and work that exceeded what should have been humanly possible. The transformation was total. Gender roles that had been fixed for centuries became fluid from necessity, women taking on everything that needed doing because there was no one else to do it. The elderly struggled, most bodies worn by decades of labor, now expected to continue working when they should have been allowed rest. Babushkas and dedushkas bending over fields they no longer had strength to work properly, maintaining gardens that kept families alive when state rations were insufficient, passing on knowledge of old ways how to preserve food, how to make something from nothing, skills that industrial age had partially erased, but that suddenly became essential for survival. The children grew up too fast, working in fields when they should have been studying, taking on adult responsibilities when they were still small, becoming caretakers of younger siblings while parents worked, losing the protected space of childhood that even Soviet ideology theoretically valued. The education was disrupted, schools closed or operated sporadically, teachers drafted or evacuated. The expectation that children would contribute to agricultural production, superseding educational goals that seemed luxuries when survival was uncertain. We reflect now on the villages that simply vanished from maps, destroyed in fighting, populations scattered and never reunited, places that existed in memory and old records but not in physical reality after the war. Some were rebuilt, but on different sites or with different names. Others remained ruins, gradually reclaimed by forest or converted to other use, their histories preserved only in oral traditions and in the memories of survivors or their descendants. The demographic change was profound. Rural areas that had been populated for centuries were depleted. Young men dead in enormous numbers. Populations aged and feminized. Villages shrinking as those who could leave did so, seeking opportunities in cities rather than remaining in the devastated countryside. The post-war period brought new challenges, returning veterans with trauma and disabilities, widows managing farms alone permanently rather than temporarily. The continued state requisitions that treated rural areas as resources to be extracted rather than as communities requiring support for recovery. Some villages received compensation or assistance. Most did not. The suffering of rural areas was less visible than urban suffering, less documented, less commemorated in official narratives focused on heroic defense of cities and industrial production. We close now imagining the fields empty of their workers, silent where once voices called across rows, the land that continues regardless of human presence, that was plowed and planted and harvested by women and elderly and children while men were gone, that absorbed blood and tears and sweat of those who remained, that holds memory in ways that documents cannot. The villages that vanished while men were gone, the women who became everything, the elderly who worked beyond strength, the children who lost childhood, the absence that transformed landscape and society, the displacement, the occupation, the partisans, the reprisals, the survival through impossible circumstances. All of it part of war's rural story, less told than urban story, but equally profound in its impact, equally devastating in its toll, equally worthy of remembrance even though memory is incomplete and records are sparse, and the voices of rural survivors are quieter in historical record than voices from cities. The silence of the countryside, the empty villages, the fields worked by those left behind, the vanishing that was gradual and then complete. The rural devastation overshadowed by urban narrative, yet equally real, equally tragic, equally testimony to what was endured when the world was at war and villages that had existed for centuries disappeared in the span of a few years. The silence holds them. The land remembers. The absence speaks. Forever gone, forever part of the story that must be told even when telling is difficult, when sources are limited, when the voices that could speak are now mostly silent. The villages, the women, the land, all transformed, all testimony, all part of war's vast human cost, forever. In the chaos of retreat, in the desperate summer and autumn of 1941, when German armies advanced faster than seemed possible, an evacuation of unprecedented scale was set in motion. We begin with the decision made in rooms where maps showed the relentless westward push of enemy forces, where Stalin and his commanders understood that Soviet industry could not be allowed to fall into German hands, that the factories producing tanks and aircraft and ammunition must be moved beyond the invaders' reach, or the war would be lost before it truly began. The decision was to move entire industries eastward to dismantle factories, to transport machinery across thousands of miles, to relocate populations along with the equipment they operated, to transform the eastern territories into new industrial heartland. It is said that the logistics were staggering. 1,500 major enterprises relocated. Countless smaller operations moved. 17 million people evacuated. A migration that dwarfed anything in human history. The trains became instruments of survival, iron lifelines carrying both industrial salvation and human displacement, operating day and night, moving through territories threatened by advancing armies, racing against time measured in the speed of German tanks, in the distance between front lines and railway junctions, in the narrow window before evacuation became impossible. We descend now into the trains themselves. Packed beyond any reasonable capacity, each car holding far more than designed for workers essential to production squeezed alongside their families. Machinery strapped to flat cars with only the most basic securing, tools and dies, and the intricate components of industrial production piled wherever space could be found. The passenger cars held people sitting and standing and lying in every available space. Children passed overhead through crowds to find corners where they might sleep. The elderly pressed against windows trying to breathe air that was increasingly scarce as more people boarded at each stop. The journeys lasted days, sometimes weeks. The distances were vast, the routes circuitous to avoid front lines, the delays constant as military trains took precedence, as tracks were damaged by bombing and required repair, as the system strained under demands it was never designed to meet. The conditions aboard were brutal. Food was scarce. Whatever people had brought with them, whatever could be distributed at stations along the route, which was often nothing, which meant hunger that grew sharper with each passing day. Water was equally scarce. Stops for refilling were irregular. The summer heat made thirst unbearable. Children cried from dehydration, while adults tried to maintain order and hope. The sanitation was non-existent. A few trains had minimal facilities. Most did not. The stops were too brief to adequately address basic human needs. The indignity and health hazards accumulated with the miles traveled. Whispers tell us of families separated in the chaos, children put on one train while parents boarded another. Promises to reunite at destinations that were sometimes changed without notification. Siblings scattered across different evacuations. The breakdown of record-keeping, meaning some separations became permanent. Some children arriving at eastern cities with no information about where parents had gone. Some parents arriving to find the children's train had been diverted elsewhere. The confusion was immense. Authorities struggled to track who was evacuated where. The sheer numbers overwhelmed any system that existed. The urgency meant that perfect organization was impossible, that some chaos was inevitable cost of speed. The destinations were cities and towns in the Urals, in Siberia, in Central Asia, places that had been remote outposts, now suddenly transformed into crucial industrial centers. Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, Tashkent, these cities swelled with evacuees, populations doubling or tripling virtually overnight, housing that had been barely adequate becoming desperately insufficient, infrastructure strained beyond capacity. The evacuees arrived to find barracks hastily constructed, schools and public buildings converted to housing, local populations sometimes resentful of the influx, sometimes welcoming, the reception varying by location and by how well prepared the city had been for the arrivals. We sit now with the work of rebuilding factories in unfamiliar territories. The machinery arrived on trains and had to be unloaded, transported to sites chosen for the new factories, assembled under conditions far from ideal. The winter of 194,142 was brutally cold even by Soviet standards, and much of the assembly happened in the open air, or in structures with no heating. Workers laboring in temperatures far below freezing to reconstruct the productive capacity that had been dismantled in the West. The urgency was absolute. Every day factories were not producing was a day the front received fewer tanks, fewer aircraft, fewer shells. So the work continued around the clock, workers sleeping in the factories they were building, wrapping themselves in whatever could provide warmth, pushing through exhaustion because the alternative was unthinkable. The evacuation saved Soviet industrial capacity. By moving factories beyond German reach, by relocating the workers who knew how to operate them, by maintaining production even during the chaos of transfer, the Soviet Union preserved the ability to supply its armies, to replace losses, to sustain a war effort that would otherwise have collapsed. The Eastern territories that had been economically peripheral became central. The Urals became the heart of Soviet tank production. Siberia's resources were fully mobilized. Central Asian cities hosted evacuated populations and integrated them into local economies. But the human cost of evacuation was immense. The people torn from homes, transported in conditions barely fit for cargo, arriving in unfamiliar climates and cultures, expected to immediately resume production in factories barely reconstructed. The children who spent formative years in evacuation, growing up in eastern cities far from birthplaces, forming identities shaped by displacement. The elderly who did not survive the journeys or the harsh conditions of resettlement, whose bodies gave out under the stress of displacement and climate and inadequate nutrition. We reflect now on those who never returned. When the war ended and the opportunity to return westward came, some chose to remain in the East. The reasons varied. They had lost everything in the West, and returning meant confronting ruins and absence. They had built new lives in the East and saw no reason to abandon them. They had married locals or found work they valued. The connections to their original homes had been severed by years of separation and loss. The evacuation created permanent demographic shifts. Western cities, depopulated during the war, never fully recovered their pre-war populations. Eastern cities grew in ways that persisted long after the war. The human geography of the Soviet Union was remade by the trains that carried everything east. There were also those who could not return, Jews who had been evacuated eastward and survived, while their communities in the West were destroyed by the Holocaust. Families whose homes no longer existed because villages had been wiped out or cities were in ruins. People whose pre-war addresses were now in different countries as borders shifted in war's aftermath. For these evacuees, the East became permanent home not by choice but by elimination of alternatives, by the closure of return as a possibility, by the transformation of the past into something that could not be reclaimed. The trains themselves continued operating long after the initial evacuations, returning some evacuees westward after the war, transporting displaced persons from territories newly incorporated into Soviet Union, moving demobilized soldiers back to peacetime lives, continuing the migrations and displacements that war had set in motion. The Soviet railway system, already vast before the war, became the infrastructure of survival, of industrial relocation, of population movement on scales that defied comprehension, of the physical manifestation of state power to reorganize space and people according to strategic necessity. We close now hearing the sound of trains, the wheels on rails, the steam engines laboring, the whistles cutting through darkness, the carriages packed with people and machinery, and the desperate hope that somewhere beyond the horizon was safety, was the possibility of rebuilding, was survival. The trains that carried everything east, the millions who rode them, the factories dismantled and reassembled, the families separated and sometimes reunited, the destinations that became new homes, the evacuation that saved industrial capacity while creating massive displacement. All of it part of the story of how the Soviet Union survived, how it moved beyond German reach the means of resistance, how it transformed geography into strategic depth, how it sacrificed individual stability for collective survival. The silence now holds the memory of those journeys, the stations where trains stopped briefly, the eastern cities that swelled with evacuees, the factories rebuilt in the cold, the people who made new lives in unfamiliar places, the trains, forever moving, forever carrying, forever testimony to displacement as survival strategy, to the millions who traveled eastward and the thousands of miles those journeys covered, to the human cost of industrial evacuation and the strategic necessity that demanded it. The trains, the evacuation, the survival, forever part of the story, forever. On walls and in newspapers, through radio broadcasts that reached into every corner of Soviet territory, through film reels projected in darkened halls, a war was depicted that differed from the war being fought. We begin with the images posters showing heroic soldiers advancing unstoppably across landscapes, their faces strong and determined, their weapons gleaming, their postures suggesting victory was not merely possible but inevitable. Workers portrayed in factories, not exhausted and underfed as they actually were, but tireless and joyful, smiling as they shaped steel, their bodies strong despite rations that could not sustain such strength, their expressions suggesting that labor itself was source of fulfillment rather than of grinding exhaustion. It is said that the propaganda machine never wavered, never hesitated, never acknowledged doubt, even when reality provided abundant reason for doubt. In the catastrophic early months when German armies advanced hundreds of miles, when cities fell and entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, when the very survival of the Soviet state hung uncertain even then, the posters and newspapers and broadcasts spoke of temporary setbacks, of strategic withdrawals, of the inevitable counterattacks that would come. Stalin was depicted as wise father guiding his children through storm to certain victory, his portrait appearing everywhere, his face becoming icon more than man, symbol of Soviet will and strength. We descend now into the techniques of persuasion. The narrative was carefully constructed. This was not merely war, but the great patriotic war, frame that connected current struggle to historical memory of defending motherland against invaders, that invoked deep emotional resonance with Russian historical consciousness. The invasion was not presented as military conflict between nations, but as existential struggle between civilization and barbarism, between the enlightened Soviet system and the fascist evil that threatened to destroy everything. The framing was powerful precisely because it contained truth the Nazi ideology did regard Slavic peoples as subhuman. The occupation was brutal beyond imagining. The stakes truly were existential. But the framing also obscured truth: the early Soviet defeats, the massive casualties, the policy failures that had left the nation unprepared for invasion. The creation of heroes was systematic. Frontline soldiers who performed acts of courage became subjects of news stories, their exploits sometimes embellished, their names and faces made known across the nation. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, the young partisan hanged by Germans, became martyr whose story was told and retold, whose image appeared on posters, whose sacrifice was held up as model of dedication to motherland. Alexander Matrosov, who reportedly threw himself on German machine gun to allow his unit to advance, became symbol of self-sacrifice, though historians later questioned whether the event happened as reported. The heroes served psychological function. They provided examples to inspire others. They proved that Soviet people could resist and triumph. They gave faces and names to abstract concepts of bravery and dedication. Whispers tell us that the role of culture in maintaining morale was considered crucial. Films were produced during wartime showing triumph and heroism. Watching These films required suspension of disbelief, given the conditions under which most viewers lived, but they provided escape and inspiration simultaneously. Music was composed celebrating motherland and predicting victory. Songs like "The Sacred War" became anthems, their lyrics expressing righteous anger and determination, their melodies designed to stir emotion and strengthen resolve. Poetry and novels reinforced official narratives, while sometimes subtly gesturing toward truth that could not be explicitly stated, walking the line between state-approved messaging and authentic expression. The selective reporting was essential to propaganda's function. Victories were announced immediately and celebrated widely. Defeats were minimized or reframed as tactical withdrawals. Casualty figures were never reported accurately. The losses were too staggering, the numbers too demoralizing, the truth too dangerous to morale to be publicly acknowledged. The siege of Leningrad was reported, but the full scale of death from starvation was obscured. The catastrophic encirclements of 1941 were acknowledged as setbacks, but the hundreds of thousands captured or killed were not quantified. The truth existed in whispers, in rumors, in the letters from front that made it past censors, but official channels maintained narratives of strength and coming victory. We sit now with the contradiction that propaganda served dual purpose. It genuinely did help maintain morale among exhausted population that needed hope to continue, but it also prevented honest reckoning with failures and costs, prevented public grieving, prevented questioning of decisions that had led to disaster. The factory worker who labored 16-hour shifts needed to believe the work mattered, that the sacrifice was for achievable goal, that victory was coming. The mother who had lost sons needed to believe their deaths had meaning, that the nation they died defending was worthy of such sacrifice, that their memory would be honored in victory. Propaganda provided this belief, constructed this meaning, whether or not the underlying reality fully supported the construction. The posters were everywhere in factories and schools, on building walls and at metro stations, impossible to avoid, their messages seeping into consciousness through sheer repetition. The themes were consistent. The Nazi enemy depicted as inhuman monster, often in caricatured form that dehumanized to make killing psychologically easier. Soviet people shown as strong and unified, differences erased in favor of collective identity. Stalin presented as wise leader whose decisions were always correct, whose guidance could be trusted absolutely. The motherland itself personified, often as female figure requiring defense, appealing to masculine protective instincts while simultaneously asserting that women too were defenders. We reflect now on how propaganda shaped memory. The official narratives promoted during the war became, for many, the way they remembered and understood their experiences. The suffering was real, but it was remembered as meaningful suffering, as necessary sacrifice for righteous cause. The victories were real, but they were remembered as products of superior Soviet system and Stalin's leadership, rather than as hard-won outcomes of massive sacrifice and some degree of luck. The complexity of experience, the simultaneous pride in contribution and bitterness about conditions, the love of homeland coexisting with resentment of state policies, the heroism alongside the confusion and fear. This complexity was simplified in official memory into narratives of unified purpose and inevitable triumph. The dissenting voices were suppressed. Anyone who questioned official narratives, who spoke of suffering in ways that emphasized victimhood rather than heroism, who criticized decisions or leadership, risked accusation of defeatism or worse. The space for honest expression of experience was severely limited, forcing people into either acceptance of official narratives or silence. The journals and letters that contained unfiltered accounts were often hidden, destroyed, or self-censored to avoid danger. The truth was fragmentary, scattered, preserved only in pieces that survived censorship and fear. The propaganda was effective not because people were naive, but because they needed it to be true. In circumstances of extreme hardship, hope is survival mechanism. Believing that suffering has purpose, that victory is coming, that sacrifice matters, these beliefs make endurance possible. Propaganda provided narrative structure that allowed people to understand their experiences as part of larger story with meaning and direction, rather than as random suffering without purpose. Whether the narrative was entirely accurate mattered less than whether it provided psychological framework for continuing. We close now contemplating the posters that remain in archives and museums, the films preserved, the songs still occasionally heard. They are historical documents now, evidence of how the war was represented rather than how it was experienced. The distance between representation and reality is the space where propaganda operated, not entirely false but not entirely true, selective in what it emphasized and what it obscured, designed to serve state purposes while claiming to serve truth. The propaganda that painted victory before it came. The posters, the films, the songs, the carefully constructed narratives. The heroes real and embellished, the defeats minimized, the suffering made meaningful through framing. All of it part of how the Soviet population was mobilized, sustained, inspired, controlled. All of it shaping not just wartime experience but post-war memory. All of it testimony to power of narrative to shape perception, to influence endurance, to construct collective understanding of events even as individual experiences complicated or contradicted official stories. The images remain. The words echo. The propaganda speaks still, not as truth but as evidence of what the state wanted people to believe, of how suffering was meant to be understood, of the gap between official narrative and lived reality. The silence holds both the propaganda and the truth it obscured, the inspiration it provided and the honest accounting it prevented. Forever both. Forever testimony to war fought on battlefields and war fought in representation, in imagery, in the shaping of consciousness and memory. The propaganda, forever painting victory, forever shaping how the war was seen and remembered, forever. In the space between front and home, in the vast distances that war created, letters existed in perpetual transit written in hope, carried through chaos, arriving sometimes months late, sometimes never arriving at all. We begin with the act of writing itself, soldiers finding moments between battle to compose messages on scraps of paper, describing conditions obliquely to pass censorship, sending love and reassurance across kilometers they could not measure, toward addresses that might no longer exist, to people who might not survive to read the words, and the families writing in return, composing responses to letters already outdated by the time they were received, addressing envelopes to military units that had moved or been destroyed, asking questions that might never be answered, maintaining connection through words alone, because words were all that remained. It is said that the Soviet postal system during wartime processed millions of letters, daily correspondence flowing in both directions, from front to rear and rear to front, a vast circulatory system of paper and ink, attempting to maintain human bonds across the ruptures war created. The system struggled under impossible demands, infrastructure damaged by warfare, routes constantly shifting as battle lines moved, addresses changing as units were reorganized or populations evacuated. The sheer volume overwhelming capacity designed for peacetime flow. Yet the system operated because it had to, because mail was morale, because soldiers fought better knowing families remembered them, and families endured better believing their soldiers were alive and thinking of them. We descend now into the censorship that every letter underwent. Military censors read each message from the front, redacting information deemed sensitive, unit locations, casualty numbers, descriptions of conditions that might undermine morale, any criticism of leadership or policy. The letters that reached families were often fragments, sentences crossed out in black ink, paragraphs removed entirely, the remaining text creating impression of normalcy that was partially or entirely false. Soldiers learned to self-censor, to write around what could not be said, to encode information in ways they hoped families would understand while censors would miss. A description of weather might indicate location. A comment about missing home might convey despair that direct statement of despair would not be allowed to express. The waiting defined home front experience. Families checked for mail daily, the arrival of a letter bringing relief beyond words, proof that their soldier lived at least as of the letter's writing. But the dates on letters revealed how long they had been in transit. A letter written 2 months prior provided information already outdated. The soldier might have been alive when writing but dead now. The peace of mind the letter provided was retroactive and therefore incomplete. And the prolonged silence when letters stopped coming created dread that gradually hardened into grief. As days became weeks, became months with no word. The hope that letters were simply delayed, giving way to assumption that no letter would come because the writer no longer lived. Whispers tell us of the official notifications that announced death, telegrams or letters in formal bureaucratic language, informing families that their son, husband, father had been killed in action, died of wounds, was missing and presumed dead. The notifications were supposed to provide closure but often raised more questions. When exactly did death occur? Where? Under what circumstances? Was the body recovered? Would it be returned for burial? The official notification was endpoint of waiting, but beginning of a different kind of torment. The permanent questions about last moments, about suffering, about final thoughts that would never be known because no last letter had been received. Because war's chaos often meant the dead disappeared into unmarked graves or were left where they fell. The letters that announced death sometimes arrived months after the fact. Military postal system was slower with bad news. Notifications got delayed in transit. Sometimes families received official word before the final letters their soldiers had written, meaning the last words arrived after already knowing they were the last words. The temporal disruption was cruelty added to cruelty. Reading letter from the dead, words written when the writer still lived. the voice present in the text while its source was gone, the impossible simultaneity of presence and absence that letters from the dead created. We sit now with what was not said, the censorship, both external and internal, that prevented honest communication. Soldiers could not describe the full horror of what they experienced because censorship forbade it, but also because language felt inadequate, because they wanted to protect loved ones from knowledge that could not be born, because trauma resists narration even when narration is permitted. Families could not express the full extent of hardship on the home front because such expression might be interpreted as defeatism, because they wanted to protect soldiers from worry about those left behind, because they understood soldiers had enough to endure without adding guilt about families suffering. The silence around trauma was vast. Soldiers returning from the front carried experiences. They could not articulate. How do you explain watching friends die? How do you describe the smell of battle, the sound of shells, the way fear becomes constant companion? How do you convey the numbness that develops as defense mechanism against too much death? The letters could not carry this weight. So letters spoke of mundane details, of looking forward to return, of love that endured despite absence, of hope for future that war had made uncertain. The letters were lifelines, but they were also inadequate, falling far short of what needed to be communicated, yet serving essential function of maintaining connection, even when true understanding was impossible. We reflect now on the archives where undelivered letters are preserved, messages that never reached intended recipients, correspondence that was returned as undeliverable, the address no longer valid, the recipient dead or displaced or simply unfindable in war's chaos. The archives hold thousands of such letters, millions perhaps, each one testimony to connection attempted and failed, to words that traveled far but not far enough, to the vast silence that war created in the spaces between people who loved each other but could not bridge the distances. Some letters were found on bodies of fallen soldiers, last messages never sent, final words to families carried in pockets when death came, sometimes recovered and forwarded, sometimes lost with everything else the dead carried. These found letters had particular poignancy. They represented intentions to communicate cut short, the unfinished business of the dead, the last thoughts that might have brought some comfort to surviving families if the letters had reached them, but often did not. The post-war period brought flood of letters seeking information, families writing to last known military units asking for information about soldiers listed as missing, writing to comrades whose names they had learned from previous letters, writing to official agencies requesting records, death certificates, any information that might provide closure. Many of these inquiries went unanswered, records were incomplete, units had been destroyed, witnesses were dead, the bureaucracy was overwhelmed. The missing remained missing, neither confirmed dead nor proven alive, existing in terrible limbo that prevented proper grieving and proper hope both. We close now imagining the letters themselves, yellowed paper in archives, ink fading, the physical objects becoming fragile even as the words they carry remain sharp. They testify to what people wanted to say, to how they tried to maintain bonds across impossible distances, to the love that persisted despite war's attempts to sever all connections. They speak of hope and fear, of longing and resignation, of the ordinary details of life that become extraordinary when written under conditions of war, when every letter might be the last, when the act of writing itself is assertion of faith that the words will reach their destination even when experience suggests they might not. The letters that never arrived, the words written in hope, the postal system struggling under impossible demands, the censorship that redacted truth, the waiting for word that sometimes never came, the notifications of death, the questions that could not be answered, the silence around trauma, the undelivered messages in archives, all of it part of how people tried to maintain humanity, to preserve connections, to communicate across the ruptures war created. All of it testimony to the inadequacy of words to fully express experience, yet the necessity of attempting expression anyway, of writing despite censorship and distance, and the likelihood that letters would not arrive or would arrive too late, of the human need to communicate even when communication is nearly impossible. The silence holds them. The archives preserve them. The words remain even when writers and intended readers are long gone. The letters, forever traveling, forever attempting to bridge distance, forever testimony to love and longing, and the desperate human need to speak across silence to those we cannot reach. Forever. In May 1945, when bells rang in Moscow's squares, when crowds filled streets that had been darkened for years by blackout orders, when news spread that Germany had surrendered unconditionally, celebration mixed with something more complex than simple joy. We begin with the official announcement, Stalin's proclamation of victory. The words broadcast across all Soviet territory, reaching soldiers at the front and families at home. The statement that after 4 years of brutal warfare, after sacrifice beyond measure, The great patriotic war had been won. The crowds gathered spontaneously, strangers embracing in the streets, tears flowing not just from relief, but from recognition of cost, from understanding of what had been endured to reach this moment. It is said that Victory Day, May 9, the date commemorated rather than May 8, when the German instrument of surrender was signed, became instant sacred moment in Soviet calendar, the culmination of what official narrative presented as inevitable triumph of superior Soviet system and Stalin's leadership. The celebrations were real, the joy genuine. People danced in the streets, kissed anyone nearby, drank whatever alcohol could be found, released years of tension and fear in hours of unrestrained celebration. For many, the primary emotion was simple relief survival, the end of daily fear of death, the possibility of beginning to rebuild lives shattered by war. We descend now into what came after initial celebration, into the reality that victory meant many things beyond the end of warfare. The soldiers began returning those who survived, walking roads westward toward homes they had left years before, carrying trauma they could not name and did not yet understand, finding cities and villages transformed by their absence. The reunions were joyful but also awkward. Families had changed. Children had grown. Some wives had remarried believing husbands were dead. Some soldiers had formed new attachments. The years of separation created distances that simple presence could not immediately bridge. Many found no homes to return to. Cities lay in ruins. Villages had been destroyed. Addresses no longer existed. Families had scattered or perished. The soldiers who had fought to defend motherland came back to discover the motherland they remembered existed only in memory, that the physical reality was rubble and absence, that victory meant surviving but not necessarily having anything to return to. The displacement continued after the war. Soldiers demobilized, but unable to find former homes, wandering through ruins trying to locate family, rebuilding lives in new places because returning to old places was impossible. Whispers tell us of the accounting that began in victory's wake, the attempt to quantify losses, to count the dead, to measure what had been sacrificed. The numbers were staggering and even now remain disputed. Official Soviet figures eventually acknowledged 27 million dead, though some estimates go higher. The vast majority civilian deaths from warfare, occupation brutality, siege conditions, disease and starvation caused by war. 27 million. The number is too large to comprehend, exceeds capacity of imagination to grasp, represents population of entire nations simply gone, erased, their futures prevented, their potential unrealized, their suffering mostly unrecorded, their names in many cases unknown and unremembered. But victory also brought pride that was genuine and justified. The Soviet Union had faced invasion by the most powerful military machine ever assembled, had been pushed to the brink of defeat, had suffered losses that would have destroyed many nations, yet had not only survived but had turned the tide, had pushed back, had conquered Berlin, had achieved military victory that seemed impossible in 1941. The pride in having survived, in having resisted, in having won this was real, was earned through sacrifice, was justified by the magnitude of what had been overcome. The contradiction was that both the pride and the grief were real, coexisted in the same heart, created emotional complexity that simple narratives could not capture. We sit now with other contradictions victory revealed. The state that had led to victory was the same state that had contributed to suffering the policies that had left Soviet Union unprepared for invasion, the purges that had weakened military leadership, the forced collectivization that had created famines before the war, the terror apparatus that had operated throughout the war. People could feel gratitude for victory, while also feeling anger at the suffering that might have been prevented. They could celebrate the state's achievement while also remembering the state's failures. But such contradictions could not be voiced publicly. The requirement was to express only gratitude, only pride, only dedication to rebuilding under Stalin's continued leadership. The post-war years brought new hardships. The famine of 194,647 killed, estimated 1 to 2 million people. The drought's impact worsened by state policies that continued requisitioning grain for export while rural populations starved. The post-war recovery taking precedence over populations' immediate needs. The cities remained crowded and damaged, housing shortages severe, rationing continuing for years, the transition to peace slower and more difficult than many had anticipated. Victory had not brought immediate prosperity, had not ended suffering, had not resolved the fundamental problems of Soviet system. The purges returned. The suspicion and terror that had characterized pre-war years resumed after brief wartime relaxation of some controls. Returning prisoners of war were interrogated as potential traitors. Those who had lived under occupation were investigated for collaboration. The populations of newly acquired territories in Eastern Europe were subjected to Soviet security apparatus. The Jews who had survived the Holocaust faced renewed anti-Semitism, disguised as anti-cosmopolitan campaign. The victory had not brought freedom or relaxation of control, if anything. Stalin's paranoia intensified in post-war years. The brief cooperation with Western allies giving way to Cold War suspicions that provided new categories of potential disloyalty. We reflect now on what victory meant for those who had sacrificed most. The mothers who had lost sons received medals and official acknowledgement, but no actual compensation, no material support. The state honoring sacrifice abstractly while providing little concrete assistance. The veterans returned to discover that military service, even service in victorious army, did not guarantee employment or housing or care for wounds physical and psychological. The survivors of siege or occupation or concentration camps found that their suffering was acknowledged only if it fit official narratives, that some forms of suffering were more acceptable to discuss than others, that the requirement was to emphasize resilience and recovery rather than to dwell on trauma. The memory of the war was rapidly shaped into official form. The Great Patriotic War became sacred narrative of Soviet history, the victory proof of system superiority. Stalin's role emphasized while acknowledging errors was forbidden. The sacrifice of people celebrated, while the policy failures that increased that sacrifice were obscured. The narrative served political purposes, unifying diverse Soviet population around shared experience, justifying continued sacrifice for rebuilding, maintaining Stalin's authority by associating him with victory. But the narrative also simplified what had been complex, erased experiences that did not fit approved story, created official memory that differed from what many individuals actually remembered. We close now contemplating photographs of Victory Day celebration. The joy visible in faces is real, the relief genuine, the sense of having survived profound. But looking closely, we can also see exhaustion. We can see bodies too thin. We can see the wear of years that should not have been endured. The victory was real, but the price was visible in every face, in every body, in the ruins behind the celebrating crowds. The victory tasted of ash because victory was survival rather than triumph, was end of one kind of suffering with knowledge that other hardships continued, was achievement earned through sacrifice so vast that celebration was always mixed with grief. The victory, the joy and the cost, the pride and the trauma, the end that was also continuation. The celebration that could not erase memory of horror, the official narrative and the private grief, the gratitude and the bitterness, the survival and the absence, all coexisting, all true simultaneously, all part of what May 1945 meant to those who lived through what had come before, the victory that tasted of ash, forever complex, forever more than simple triumph, forever testimony to what was endured and what endurance cost and what even victory could not restore. Forever. In the institutions swelling beyond capacity, in railway stations where children waited with tags around their necks, in the spaces between family and state, a generation grew up marked by war's particular cruelties. We begin with numbers that struggle to capture human reality. Estimated 25 million Soviet children lost one or both parents during war years, left orphaned by death or separated by displacement. By the thousand ways war tears families apart. The state proclaimed responsibility for these children, established orphanages, and passed policies meant to provide for those who had lost everything, declared that the motherland would care for its orphaned children. But the gap between proclamation and reality was vast, measured in crowded dormitories and insufficient food, and the impossibility of providing genuine care when resources were inadequate and the numbers were overwhelming. It is said that the orphanages became cities unto themselves, massive institutions housing hundreds or thousands of children, organized with bureaucratic efficiency, but lacking the capacity for individual attention, for emotional nurturing, for the thousand small kindnesses that children require. The children slept in shifts when beds were insufficient, 3 children rotating through 2 beds, sleep schedules overlapping to maximize use of limited space. The food was rationed strictly, portions calculated to minimum subsistence, hunger constant presence even in institutions meant to protect. The staff did what they could, but ratios of children to caregivers made meaningful relationships nearly impossible, supervision replacing care, management replacing nurturing. We descend now into the lives of children in these institutions. They wore uniforms when available, identical clothing that erased individual identity, that marked them as wards of the state, that signified their orphaned status to anyone who saw them. They attended schools when schools operated, learned lessons that emphasized duty to motherland, that trained them to be productive Soviet citizens, that prepared them for lives of contribution and service. The education was utilitarian, focused on practical skills, on literacy and mathematics that would serve economic purposes, on political indoctrination that would ensure loyalty. The arts, the humanities, the cultivation of individual talents or interests. These were luxuries that orphanages rarely provided. The children formed their own societies within institutions' hierarchies based on age and strength, alliances for mutual protection, friendships that became substitute for family bonds. They learned to navigate institutional life, to follow rules that governed every aspect of existence, to suppress individual needs in favor of collective functioning. Some thrived in this environment, finding security in structure, forming identities around being part of institution. Others withered, lost in the anonymity of masses, unable to adapt to life without individual attention, without the particular love that family provides and institution cannot replicate. Whispers tell us of the children who fled institutions, who could not bear the regimentation, who chose uncertain freedom of streets over secure confinement of orphanages. These were the besprizorniki, the homeless children who became visible presence in railway stations and city streets, who survived through begging and theft, who formed gangs for mutual protection and joint survival. They slept in stations and abandoned buildings, in culverts and makeshift shelters, wherever offered some protection from weather and from predators human and otherwise. The street children developed their own culture languages of signs and gestures, hierarchies based on streetwise intelligence, codes of conduct that governed behavior within groups. They protected each other fiercely, understood that survival depended on mutual support, that alone on the streets meant vulnerability that could be fatal. But they also exploited each other, the strong preying on the weak, the older children sometimes using younger ones for purposes that childhood should never know. The street was simultaneous refuge and danger, freedom and brutal education in survival at any cost. The authorities periodically swept stations and streets, collecting homeless children and returning them to institutions, but the children often fled again, preferring known dangers of streets to institutional life they found unbearable. The cycle repeated: collection, placement, flight, survival on streets, collection again. Some children were eventually integrated into institutions or placed with families. Others remained on margins throughout war and into post-war period, a population that challenged official narratives of state care, that represented the orphans who fell through the system, despite the system's proclaimed universality. We sit now with the children who were taken in by extended family or neighbors, absorbed into households already strained, becoming additional mouths to feed when food was scarce, additional bodies to shelter when space was insufficient. These children were luckier than those in institutions or on streets, but their situation was complicated. They understood they were burdens, however loved they might also be, that their presence stretched already insufficient resources, that they owed debts of gratitude that could never be repaid. They learned to be quiet, to need less, to help however they could, even when their help was limited by youth and strength. The psychological wounds were deep and mostly unacknowledged. The children who watched parents killed, who survived siege conditions that killed others, who were separated from siblings and never reunited, who experienced occupation brutality, or the chaos of evacuation. They carried traumas that Soviet system did not recognize or address. The expectation was resilience, that children would adapt, that youth meant psychological flexibility that would heal without intervention. But trauma does not respect age, and the wounds inflicted on children during war years would manifest throughout lives, in difficulties forming attachments, in hypervigilance and anxiety, in the particular grief of losses experienced too young to fully process them. The war orphans were used in propaganda, their resilience held up as proof of Soviet strength, their integration into institutions presented as evidence of states' care and capability, their stories told in ways that emphasized heroism and adaptation rather than suffering and loss. Some orphans became symbols. Zoya Kosmodmyanskaya's younger brother, for instance, whose martyred sister's legacy he was expected to honor, who was raised in institutions and taught to embody the sacrifice his family had made. The orphans as symbols served state purposes, but the orphans as individuals lived lives more complex than symbols could capture. We reflect now on what it meant to grow up during and after war without parents. Childhood requires attachment, requires the particular attention and love that family ideally provides, requires sense of belonging and security that allows healthy development. The war orphans were denied this, or received only partial versions of it, or found substitutes that could not fully replace what was lost. They grew into adults marked by experiences of abandonment and loss, by institutional life or street survival, or the complicated dynamics of being taken in, by the particular loneliness of growing up without the people who should have been there. After the war, as Soviet Union rebuilt, some orphans were adopted, found new families, created bonds that partially healed early wounds. Others aged out of institutions into adult life unprepared for independence, without networks of support that family provides, without resources or connections that make navigating adult life easier. Some succeeded despite disadvantages, found work and created families and built lives. Others struggled, the early traumas creating difficulties that persisted throughout lives, that manifested in mental health issues or addiction or inability to form stable relationships. We close now contemplating what Soviet Union owed these children and what it provided. The state proclaimed care but provided institutions. The state promised future but often delivered only survival. The state used orphans as symbols but rarely addressed their individual needs. The war created orphans in numbers too vast for any system to adequately handle. But the inadequacy was also product of priorities. Resources that might have provided better care were allocated to military rebuilding, to industrial development, to projects that served state interests over individual welfare. The orphans of the motherland, the millions who lost parents, the institutions, the street children, the adoption into strained households, the trauma unaddressed, the propaganda that made symbols of individuals, the resilience that was real but should not have been required, the losses that childhood should never experience. All of it part of war's cost, part of what a generation endured, part of the testimony to what happens when war destroys families and leaves children to navigate survival in systems that cannot provide what children need. The orphans, forever marked, forever carrying losses too heavy for youth. Forever testimony to war's reach into the most vulnerable lives. Forever. In the rooms where documents accumulate in silence, where files bear names and numbers that represent lives, where history is both preserved and obscured, the past speaks in whispers. We begin with the paradox that defined Soviet documentation. The state recorded obsessively, created paper trails of requisitions and rations and labor and death, maintained files on millions of citizens, generated reports and statistics, and the endless bureaucratic record of state functioning. Yet simultaneously, the state suppressed information, classified documents that contradicted official narratives, created gaps where uncomfortable truths should be acknowledged, destroyed records that threatened approved versions of history. The archives contain both the evidence and the silences, the documentation and the gaps, the testimony of what was recorded, and the absence that speaks of what was deliberately obscured. It is said that for decades, access to wartime archives was restricted, that researchers were allowed only to consult materials that supported official narratives, that documents contradicting those narratives remained classified, or were made available only to trusted scholars who could be relied upon to interpret them correctly. The archives were sites of control as much as sites of preservation, places where history was managed, where the record was curated to serve ideological purposes, where truth was negotiable rather than absolute. We descend now into the work of researchers who navigate these archives. After Soviet collapse, when restrictions eased, when previously classified materials became accessible, when the project of reconstructing fuller picture of wartime experience became possible, historians began the patient work of piecing together fragments. They read official reports against personal testimonies, looked for what was absent as well as what was present, developed methods for reading between lines of censored documents, for finding truth in silences and omissions as much as in explicit statements. The challenges are immense. Records were destroyed, some deliberately, to hide evidence of crimes or failures, some accidentally in war's chaos, some lost to simple neglect and the ravages of time. Testimonies were suppressed, survivors silenced by fear, or by official prohibition against speaking experiences that contradicted approved narratives. Voices lost because they were never recorded or were recorded and then hidden. The oral histories collected after Soviet collapse come from survivors who were old when they finally spoke, whose memories were filtered through decades of living with silence, whose willingness to speak was shaped by political changes that made speaking finally safe, but also by the difficulty of articulating what had long been forced into silence. Whispers tell us what the archives reveal. The scope of death from famine in Leningrad was worse than officially acknowledged. The numbers of civilian casualties from occupation brutality were minimized. The extent of NKVD operations during war years was obscured. The treatment of ethnic minorities and prisoners of war was hidden. The failures of military leadership were blamed on individuals rather than acknowledged as systemic. The archives document not just what happened, but what the state wanted to hide, what stories threatened the heroic narrative, what truths complicated the simple tale of Soviet triumph through superior system and wise leadership. The personal documents are particularly revealing: diaries kept despite danger, letters hidden because they contained unauthorized truths, photographs that showed what was not supposed to be seen. These materials preserved fragments of individual experience, testimony that contradicted official accounts, evidence that people understood differently from how they were told to understand. That private knowledge often diverged from public story. The diaries describe hunger in detail that official accounts minimized, record fears and doubts that propaganda demanded be suppressed, preserve names and details that otherwise would have disappeared. We sit now with the ethical questions that archival research raises. How to represent suffering that survivors could not speak about during lifetimes. How to honor both the heroism that was real and the failures that were also real. How to acknowledge complexity when simplification served important psychological and political functions for survivors. How to balance respect for those who endured with commitment to historical accuracy. The researchers wrestle with these questions, knowing that every choice about what to emphasize and what to minimize shapes how history is understood, that they hold responsibility for representing experiences not just to academic audiences, but to descendants, to subsequent generations who will know wartime years primarily through histories written now. The archives also reveal what is missing. The voices of those who died are largely absent. The millions who perished left few records, their experiences known only through traces in others' testimonies, through absences in family records, through statistical evidence of deaths recorded but not described. The rural experiences are underrepresented records concentrated in cities, rural areas less documented, the suffering of village populations less visible in archives than suffering of urban populations. The experiences of certain groups are harder to recover: women's voices, children's experiences, the perspectives of ethnic minorities, the testimony of those whose stories were least likely to be officially recorded or preserved. We reflect on the ongoing process of revelation. Archives continue opening, materials continue becoming accessible, oral histories continue being collected from the last surviving witnesses. Each new opening reveals more complexity, more evidence that challenges or nuances previous understandings, more testimony to experiences that official histories overlooked or minimized. The history of Soviet wartime experience is still being written, will continue being rewritten as more evidence becomes available, as methodologies improve, as questions change and new generations of researchers bring new perspectives. The responsibility is profound. The generation that experienced the war directly is passing. The last survivors are now very old, their numbers diminishing. The window for collecting first-hand testimony closing. What historians do now with archives, how they represent what they find, What questions they ask and what silences they attend to this work determines how future generations will understand what happened, how the sacrifices will be remembered, whether the full complexity will be preserved, or whether simplified narratives will prevail. We close now in the silence of archive reading rooms, where researchers sit with files, making notes, photographing documents, building the record from fragments. The archives whisper what could not be spoken, the truth suppressed, the experiences hidden, the voices silenced. They testify to what was endured and to what endurance cost, to the heroism and the horror, to the achievement and the failure, to the complexity that defies simple narrative. The archives preserve and obscure, reveal and hide, speak and remain silent. They are not neutral repositories, but are sites where power operated and continues operating, where control was exercised and is still exercised, where history is made and remade through what is preserved and what is lost, what is accessible and what remains restricted, what is attended to and what is ignored. The silence speaks. The gaps testify. The documents preserved bear witness. The papers that survived carry voices forward. The archives that hold wartime records are sacred spaces, in secular sense places where memory is housed, where testimony is kept, where the obligation to remember is enacted through patient work of preservation and research and interpretation. The archives whisper what cannot be spoken, forever holding, forever revealing, forever the repository of experiences too vast to fully comprehend, too important to forget, too complex to simplify, too sacred to betray through careless or ideological representation. The archives, forever whispering, forever demanding attention, forever testimony to what was lived and what survives in fragments, what can be known and what remains uncertain, what speaks clearly and what speaks only in silence. Forever. The night is deep now. The stories have been told. The past has spoken through the silence of years, through the archives and memories, through the testimony of those who survived and those who did not, through the complexity that resists simple understanding but demands our attention nonetheless. Rest now. Let these stories settle like snow upon the landscape of memory. Let the lives lived, the sacrifices made, the endurance beyond comprehension, the humanity persisting through inhumanity, let all of it rest with you as you drift toward sleep, as consciousness releases its hold, as the day gives way to night and night to dreams. The past is gone but not forgotten. The voices speak still. The testimony endures, and in remembering we honor what was lived, what was lost, what survived against all odds. Sleep now. The stories are told. The night is yours. The silence is earned. Rest.